Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. This morning we have with us both the Departments of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal and the Department of Health and Wellness, and we'll be discussing public-private partnerships for public infrastructure. I'd like to remind everyone to make sure their cell phone is placed on silent, and we will begin with introductions, starting with Mr. McGuire.
Good morning, Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good morning, Suzanne Lonis-Croft, MLA Lunenburg.
Chuck Porter, Hants West.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning, Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobequid.
I'm Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, and your chair. We also have with us the Auditor General's office this morning, Mr. Spicer.
Terry Spicer, Deputy Auditor General.
And we'll allow our witnesses to introduce themselves. We'll begin with Ms. Surratt.
Hi there, I'm Diane Surratt with Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Deputy Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
John O'Connor, Executive Director of Major Infrastructure Projects at Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Gary Porter, Executive Director of Corporate Initiatives, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Tracy Barbrick, Associate Deputy Minister with Department of Health and Wellness.
Denise Perrette, Deputy Minister, Health and Wellness.
And Christine Gibbons, with Director of Corporate Process and Quality with Health and Wellness.
Well, thank you, everyone. We'll start also with opening comments, and I'm not sure who wishes to go first, health or transportation. Mr. LaFleche?
Go first.
Okay.
And you've already done my first page.
Oh, good.
Did you have it in advance?
I know.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation to talk about P3 health delivery arrangements, infrastructure. We believe P3 models are largely misunderstood and often misrepresented in public discussion, so we welcome an opportunity as civil servants to offer some explanation as to what they are and under what circumstances government might consider a project suitable for a P3 arrangement. Having said that, my remarks are not meant to persuade or dissuade you on the merits of P3. But I do want to explain why governments might consider these types of arrangements for large infrastructure projects, especially when it is in the best interests of taxpayers. In fact, I might say only when it is in the best interests. Nova Scotia governments, past and present, and of all political parties represented here today, have engaged in P3 arrangements. Some of you will recognize, such as the Cobequid Pass Toll Highway, the Halifax Convention Centre, and schools, and others will be less well known, as in the case of leased office space, which we do quite a bit of. In fact, all of the parties are in leased office space, or the Central Nova Scotia Correctional Facility located in Birdside, which is a P3. If the business case supports it, there can be mutual benefits for all partners involved in public-private partnerships. P3s, or 3Ps, or PPPs, are everywhere. Across the country and around the world, P3s are defined at a high level as a long-term, performance-based approach to procuring public infrastructure. So we're talking about infrastructure here, not the services side. The private sector assumes a major share of the risks in P3s in terms of financing and construction, and typically ensures effective performance of the infrastructure from design and planning to long-term maintenance over its life. The public sector specifies what it wants and leaves as much scope as possible to the private sector to find solutions to deliver the best results that are in the taxpayers' interests. P3s can be a way to deliver large infrastructure projects that speeds up the delivery of the project and transfers the day-to-day operating risk to the private partner, such as building upkeep and operational costs, while allowing the government partner to do what it does best in terms of operating its services to the public. P3s can also encourage efficiency and innovation with respect to design, construction, financing, operation, and ongoing maintenance of the facilities. A quick internet search, which your clerk here did and produced 547 pages for you, will give you a sense of how commonly used P3s are to support everything from healthcare, infrastructure, to roads, transit, and schools, In some foreign jurisdictions, they are also used to advance social services, such as housing developments, irrigation, or power supply. Not all risks can be effectively transferred to the private sector. Not every project is suitable for a P3 delivery arrangement. In some cases where projects don't have high construction costs, or where the development is largely renovation versus new construction, the market may be less interested or unwilling to assume the risk. There are perception issues, however, that seem to be born from a lack of shared understanding of what a P3 is, which also contributes to the complexity of evaluating P3 projects and in determining whether they have been successful or not. P3s are not a one-size-fits-all model, and each must be considered within a local context. As well, ongoing and diligent monitoring to ensure each party is receiving the best value for money is key to any P3 arrangement. That's why careful consideration of the business case at the front end is critical. This is a vital point that we need to emphasize and keep in mind. As I've mentioned, I'm not trying to make a case for P3s. Rather, as custodians of the public purse, we are obliged to explore all possible options to move major public infrastructure projects forward. The invitation to appear before the Public Accounts Committee today included an invitation for the Department of Health and Wellness. Before moving on, I want to point out that there are currently no P3 hospitals in Nova Scotia. However, the province does have a private-public arrangement to support the 811 system and ambulance service. As you are aware, government has embarked upon a multi-year project to redevelop the QE2 Health Sciences Centre. The project includes the demolition of the Centennial and Victoria buildings at the VG site, redistribution of outpatient services outside the downtown core, expansion of the Cancer Centre, an operating room addition at Hants Community Hospital, renovations and additions at the Dartmouth General Hospital, and a new hospice care facility. Suffice to say that while we don't yet have a full price tag, it will be a costly endeavor. Work at the Dartmouth General Hospital alone is in the range of 130 to 140 million. Some of the remaining parts of the project, we will be exploring suitability for a P3 arrangement. The QE2 redevelopment project is a little different than some of the projects we've looked at in other provinces on the health side, in that it's a combination of new construction, additions, and renovations. And I mentioned earlier that that might make it less attractive to the private sector and to us for a P3 arrangement. Some of the project may be suitable and some not, but it has to be a large enough scale also. So when you break the project down into components, some of those components which might be suitable for P3 might not have the scale to be suitable anymore. Many large hospital projects across Canada have been successfully delivered using a P3 model, and we are working with our provincial territorial counterparts to learn from their experiences. In Ontario, they have only built large hospitals with P3 arrangements in the last decade. Any decision to pursue a P3 delivery would only be made after full evaluation of our specific project and its individual attributes using industry-recognized processes for evaluating the business case. I want to point out that if a P3 were to move forward, it would be about the infrastructure, the building, not about healthcare delivery. John O'Connor is leading the QE2 redevelopment project. He's a 35-year veteran of the department. He's been involved in virtually every major healthcare infrastructure build since he's joined government 35 years ago. He's got a great deal of experience in leading these projects, and all of them have been conventional builds. He also has a great deal of knowledge about P3 delivery models. He was our chief engineer on the public works side until this spring. However, he would be the first one to tell you, and he can tell you if you question him, that he's not an expert. In fact, we don't believe there are any experts because every situation is really different and we have to look at the circumstances. Different types of P3s appear in a continuum, and they are extensively used in Canada. In fact, I mentioned leases could be considered a P3, and we've done leases for decades in Nova Scotia. In fact, the federal government has demonstrated their commitment to exploring P3 delivery by establishing P3 Canada, a Crown corporation responsible for considering business cases appropriate for public-private partnerships. The bottom line is that exploring a public-private partnership is just that, it's an option. As civil servants, we are required to bring all options to government, whether they like it or not. They can turn them down. In fact, we bring options ranging from do nothing to do everything. It's our job. So the fact that we bring an option to government doesn't mean they support it. It just means we're doing our due diligence as civil servants, and bringing P3s to government is part of our due diligence. To ensure we consider a P3 option for our redevelopment of the QE2 Health Sciences Centre, today we're issuing a request for supplier qualifications for P3 advisory services for the QE2 redevelopment project. Now, we could have issued it yesterday, which we were actually going to do originally before this meeting was called, but we decided we'd issue it today. So poor Jean and his colleagues had to wait an extra day. But the good news is Teresa or Heather are standing outside, so if they want to run up from the media room, they will have copies of the RFSQ for them. The advisory service will assess the P3 delivery services option through a business case analysis. From there, government will determine an approach that is in the best interest of Nova Scotians. I'm going to table this particular document here today. I've got to dig it out from among the 547 pages that Kim produced, so give me a couple of minutes here. Kim, where is she? There. Oh, here we go.
Order.
Gary found it.
Mr. LaFleche, we typically allow, about 4 or 5 minutes for an introduction, and I've been generous this morning. And as you know, it can reduce the amount of time for questions, and I know you wouldn't want to do that to the committee. So I would ask you if you could try to wrap it up here in the next minute or so.
Well, you cut me off before I was going to say thank you. We're happy to take your questions.
Okay.
So you actually wasted 30 seconds.
Well, my
apologies,
my
error. I should have
error.
given you the speech beforehand, so you knew that.
Okay.
Okay, we're done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Can I just say, though, I am
Yes.
under the weather today, and I may have to take a break.
That's fine.
But I'm sure that Ms. Barbrick can do an ample job of talking while I'm not.
Sure. Okay, well, we will now ask Ms. Perrett, would you like to provide the introduction? Thank you.
Hope you make up some time here.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much for the invitation to attend public accounts. The question of how to provide healthcare services that best serve the public interest is a challenge that all provinces and territories are grappling with, and they're complex matters that require careful consideration. So I want to say that I appreciate how important the work of the Public Accounts Committee is. I think it's essential that there's a test and challenge function worked into the provision of services, particularly in the healthcare sector. I do have to say that this is week 2 for me on the job. I'm a new hire. So I'm probably not briefed on all the matters that you're interested in, but I'll do my best to answer your questions, and I know I have the support of my colleagues here. So again, thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Perrett, and thank you for being with us this morning. We do know that you've just come on, and that's understandable, but we appreciate the respect you've shown for the committee to be here, and I think that sends a good message from the Department of Health and from government. We'll now begin with questions. We'll start with Mr. Houston of the PC Caucus for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for appearing this morning. The P3 model can absolutely be the right solution when the benefits exceed the costs, and Deputy LaFleche was kind of alluding to that in numerous points in his opening statements, and he made things like the P3 model, statements like the P3 model is misunderstood, but that evaluating whether it's successful or not is the key. So I'd like to ask Deputy LaFleche, has your department gone back and analyzed the P3 deals let's talk about the schools specifically that are on the table right now, coming due, and the Cobequid Pass. Has your department backwards analyzed those deals to see if they were good deals for Nova Scotians?
Mr. LaFleur.
Well, I'll ask Ms. Surratt to talk about the Qualifications Pass. Unfortunately, we're not able to talk about the schools. Those were deals done in the mid-90s. John O'Connor will have a short statement on the schools.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I guess the specific question is, has the department, not who did them, not when they happened, not what department is responsible for them, but your department, as the Department of Infrastructure Renewal, has your department backwards analyzed the deals that are on that the province previously did to see if they were good deals or bad deals?
Well, John O'Connor will answer that question.
Sure. Okay, Mr. O'Connor, thank you.
The short answer is no, we have not gone back through a backwards analysis of all the deals for the P3 schools. We've read all the reviews that were done by others. I've read the KPMG reports from 1999 that were in the package we received. I read Auditor General reports. We've read a lot of the materials that other people have provided, and we will be, that information, along with all the best practices and lessons learned that we get from others across Canada, will be part of what we're going to be considering as we assess whether our projects are well suited for P3.
From the review that's been done, whether it's detailed or not, it doesn't sound like it's very detailed, but from the review that's been done, were the deals that the province entered into good deals or bad deals in your assessment? Let's talk about the schools specifically.
I can speak to the buildings. Our Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, were involved in the schools from creating the output specifications for the buildings themselves, so the design requirements standards, and then we had a role in overseeing the design and overseeing construction. So from that perspective, I can speak to that, say that yes, those buildings were good buildings, and they were designed and built to a similar standard that we were using for our own buildings.
Let's put that to the side, because assumably whoever built the buildings would have did a good job, especially if you guys were involved. But I guess I go back to the deputy, because the deputy is going to play a key role in this, and ask a very specific question. Were the deals that were entered into good for the taxpayers of this province or not from an economic sense? Do you know?
You'd have to ask the Deputy of Education and Early Childhood that question.
Well, unfortunately, you're the Department of Infrastructure Renewal. You're the person responsible for buildings in the province. All provincial buildings in this province fall under your mandate. So unfortunately, that's kind of on your shoulders. And as we look at building things going forward, you mentioned quite enthusiastically in your opening comments that you were evaluating deals in other parts of the country, talking to people across the country that had done deals. I guess what that triggered in my mind is, have you looked at the deals that we've done in Nova Scotia to see if there's lessons to be learned from an economic sense? And I guess the answer is no at that point. Is that a fair statement?
I think John said we have looked at all that information and we're incorporating as we go forward. But we do not have responsibility for those schools. We do have a responsibility as of service exchange, service transfer on April 1st, 2015 for all schools going forward. So we are now building schools. There is no initiative to build a P3 school right now. No. And if we do build P3 schools, we'll let you know and we'll do a proper evaluation of them.
In terms of the schools, specifically, and then we'll talk about the other ones, but I think it's important to look at the history here. I mean, you've mentioned that people are leery of P3, it's misunderstood was the word you used. So I think if we're going to do a service to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, we should help them understand where we're at and why we got here. And I think the most fundamental thing you can do to help them understand is look at the deals we've done and have an honest assessment of them. In terms of the schools, we have P3 schools, 39 schools. Do you have an understanding of how much those schools have cost the taxpayers to date from capital from the ones that have purchased? Do you know roughly how much the taxpayers have spent on those 39 schools?
No, that's not our jurisdiction. You'd have to ask the Deputy Minister of Education.
Would it surprise you if the taxpayers of Nova Scotia have spent $878 million on those schools? And that's an average. And that's an average. That's an average of, I guess it's almost $35 million per school. Now, two schools there was recently schools built. I think the Premier is eyeing up a school in his constituency that was, believe, in the $26 to $28 million range for a brand new school. Same with the Minister of Education. I think today we'll hear where maybe might be some other schools. Maybe they'll be in non-government side held constituencies. We'll have to see later today. But that's just a back of the cigarette package analysis. $30 to $35 million for schools under the P3 model. Seems like it's a bit more, and I'm just wondering if you've looked at that. And I guess as a department, you haven't looked at that. You've looked at other places in the country, but maybe not at a Nova Scotian experience. Is that a fair summary or no?
We have people in government who looked at that. They're not here today.
Okay.
You didn't ask them to be here. You wanted to talk about health infrastructure.
Okay.
So you should have probably asked the Deputy Minister of Education and Early Childhood.
Okay, thank you for the advice on witness scheduling. I guess what I would ask you, as the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure Renewal, can you please provide to the committee, not today, but at some point at your leisure over the next little while, the analysis that the people who work for you in your department have done on the P3s, and maybe, Mr. Chair, that's something that's an analysis that we can as a committee see as to the backwards analysis is what the taxpayers have experienced in terms of a P3 model, which is in the news, which is the schools. Maybe we can get that analysis, Mr. Chair. But the reason I'm asking is I think if we cut through the chase and talk about what people are concerned about with the P3 model, and the concerns that I hear are not ideological concerns with P3. People want the best bang for their tax dollars. People are not, I don't find, and maybe we'll hear from some of my colleagues today, but I actually don't believe that most Nova Scotians are ideologically opposed to the model. What they're opposed to is getting a bad deal. And the history of P3 models in many places, and some of them certainly in this province, are quite simply that the government has been outclassed or outmaneuvered or something on negotiations of how it works. I'll talk about some of the specific things in the schools, because I think that it's clear that from the outset, the government people who negotiating it didn't think of a number of details. So if the real concern of taxpayers is that they're going to get a bad deal, have you thought about how you're going to mitigate that? When you approach them, how are you going to mitigate the risk to taxpayers that they get a bad deal on a transaction?
I actually think you're quite right in terms of there's always a danger of getting a bad deal. When we negotiate with the private sector, they know certain things we don't know, particularly about permitting, about construction costs and financing, and so we've got to have an advantage. We've got to gain some leverage on them. And I can't comment on the deals that were done in 1996 by different people in a different era, which we have not had responsibility for under a different accounting system. But I can comment that going forward, and the deals we've done in recent years, we do ensure that we have maximum leverage or we'll not be entering a deal. If we don't know what we're talking about, we're not going to go invent deals for nothing. We want to make sure the taxpayers' interests are protected. And maybe I can ask John to talk about some of the...
No, that's fine. I guess
no, that's not fine, because you asked the question, so let us answer it. John?
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, the question I asked was very specific in how the government is going to mitigate the risk that they kind of get out negotiated.
And Mr. O'Connor will go over that.
Well, I guess what would do, Mr. Chair, I don't want this to disintegrate into this thing that happens sometimes, but I have a limited amount of time. I'm trying to ask very specific questions. I'm trying to ask questions that can be answered by one person. If we're going to have a situation where one person's not going to answer it and multiple people are going to answer it, I think let's just go right to the person who's going to answer it immediately instead of kind of burning up some clock there on me. I guess what I'm asking, and maybe I'll rephrase my question. If the government...
Mr. Hughson, please direct it to somebody specifically if you wish.
Sure. I'm going to stick with the deputy as the person responsible for the department. Would the government, has the government considered as they look forward to P3s, would they bring in consultants from industry to help on their side with negotiations? Or would you anticipate that negotiations would always be done by the internal staff?
We have already spoken to many consulting groups on P3s. In fact, they're contacting us because they know of the potential here and they know of the potential in other provinces. So we've had a lot of meetings with them. They've set up meetings with us in other provinces. There are any number of people who have worked on the government side as consultants of governments who we could engage. We've used them in the past, and if appropriate, we will use them in the future.
Okay, thank you.
We're not, but wait a minute, I'm not finished. We're not going to hire consultants just to pay consultants, though. We're going to hire consultants when they add value to the process. We feel they do add value. We feel they do help us protect the taxpayers' interest. So in all probability, we'll be using them.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the Yarmouth Ferry contract that the province entered into, was that negotiated by internal staff, or were there consultants that helped with those negotiations from the government side? Just say yes or no will be fine on that contract. Was it negotiated by internal staff exclusively, or did you use consultants to help negotiate that contract?
We use both.
Internal staff and consultants?
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned people are coming forward to help you negotiate contracts. Consultants are reaching out to you in anticipation of some P3 projects in this province. Are you also hearing from, have you had discussions with any of the vendors? Are people approaching you saying, hey, we'd like to do a P3 road project in Nova Scotia, or we'd like to do a P3 hospital project? Are people reaching out to you, and are you in discussions with any of those people to build a P3 project?
A lot of the people who currently build public buildings, whether be they hospital facilities, schools, museums, office buildings that renovate them for us, are in the P3 business in other provinces, not here yet. And they have approached us. At my level, we would only be a little more than a telephone call, but there have been educational meetings, but that's about it.
Okay, how many? Okay, thank you. So has anyone submitted a proposal to you for any P3 project? Any new P3 project? VG or roads, let's talk about specifically. Have you received, has any party gone so far as to give you a proposal?
A formal proposal? No.
An informal proposal?
Well, we get informal proposals on everything every day.
Okay, has people
unsolicited proposals, but none of them are of the quality that would be considered a proposal.
Okay, but people put numbers down on a piece of paper and say, if you want us to build a VG under a P3 model.
No, we rarely get numbers. We would get just, we can do this, here's our expertise, here's what we've done before, but they're not specific to any proposal.
Okay, how many such proposals would you say you've received, roughly?
On P3 specifically, or on anything?
On VG specifically, P3 and roads and road projects specifically going forward?
I would say none.
You haven't received any?
Not that I know of. No.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that someone somewhere, an MLA, maybe Brendan McGuire got a proposal. I have no idea.
Okay, no, I'm asking.
Maybe Brendan knows.
No.
But, you know, we don't do that. We have a specific process. That's why we're going through that RFSQ today.
Okay.
There's a procurement procedure we have to follow. That doesn't mean someone can't call us up. And if they do, we will certainly listen to them like we listen to everybody.
Okay, thank you. I do want to talk specifically about the VG. Prime Minister was here last week or the week before, a couple weeks ago. I can't remember when it was. He was asked a very specific question about the VG. And his answer was that the province should decide what their own priorities are. It was clear from his answer that he didn't know if the VG was a priority for this province, and that our officials should find out. So I'd like to ask you, is the VG a priority, and have you talked to federal people about money for it?
The VG is very much a priority for this province. I call it the QE2 redevelopment is very much a priority. Prior to the current government, under the last government, the NDP government of Mr. Wilson, I believe, was Health Minister. Mr. Wilson knows that I myself went to Ottawa. That was under the Harper government at the time. And when they were looking at New Build Canada, I think Mr. Wilson was very interested in possibly having eligibility for health facilities, or what we called major regional health facilities under the New Build Canada envelope, which at that time the Harper government was doing consultations on.
So would it be
Can I finish?
No,
you asked the question. You never seem to want
order.
to.
We'll
I'm
allow
satisfied with
order. We'll allow Mr. Flesch to just.
There's a whole
wrap it up.
history here.
Just order. Order. Mr. Houston, proceed. Your mic is not on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, I guess the question was, is it a priority? You said it is a priority. You said you've been to Ottawa to talk about it. Maybe the Prime Minister doesn't know about it, but people in his department, I guess you would say, should know that it's a priority. That's all. That was the only question. It doesn't require a bunch of history. It's just a question, but is it a priority? That's all. So in terms of the QE2 redevelopment, obviously P3 is an option you're thinking about. How many other options are there that you're thinking about to cover the cost of that?
Mr. LaFleche?
The QE2 is a very multifaceted project, and you see we're involving Dartmouth, we're involving Hants, we're probably involving an ambulatory building which is not in the downtown core, we're involving the Halifax Infirmary, and before we get to the end of it, we'll probably involve some of the rural regional hospitals. So the P3 opportunity, in our mind, has to be of a certain scale. Probably 100 million or more is what would interest the private sector. They were most interested in a new build. The Halifax Infirmary job would be an addition to the existing infirmary, would be an add-on. So it might be interesting, it might be large enough, or we could do a combined project with the ambulatory building, which also might be large enough and will not be at that Halifax Infirmary site.
Thank you. I guess my question wasn't how many projects are involved. I guess my question was the options for financing them. So P3 is a financing option, obviously, and I'm just asking, what other options are you looking at? And would it be fair to say that it's either P3 or conventional, borrow money and build? Are those the two options?
Those are the only two options, unless, of course, something happens and the clouds open and Prime Minister Trudeau decides to make healthcare facilities eligible, which the second meeting I had in Ottawa under the Liberal government was with Prime Minister Trudeau. I didn't get a chance to say that, not Prime Minister Trudeau, but his officials, who were then consulting on their infrastructure program. So we went back again after Mr. Wilson sent us, Mr. Glavine sent us. And we had all those conversations and we rallied support from other provinces, but we didn't get over the top. So Prime Minister Trudeau did not approve that healthcare facilities would be eligible for either the new Build Canada Fund or new infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr.
But there
Chair.
is a possibility that he might change his mind.
Okay, so that'd be a third option. So we're talking about P3, we're talking about the feds cut a check, or we're talking about conventional financing. Have you thought of is there any other new kind of out-of-the-box thinking? Have you reached out to Nova Scotia and say, how could we fund it? Maybe we could do a new lottery. Is there any other options you're looking at, or is it just hope that the feds do something, or P3 or conventional? Is that the extent of your thought process for financing the hospital?
Well, we'd really have to have Byron Rayfuse, the Deputy Minister of Finance and Treasury Board, here to answer that, because my job is to build the facilities. His job is to find the money for them.
Okay, fair
now,
enough.
I do have a job to go and find cost-shared infrastructure money if that exists, so that would be part of what I would do. But I don't decide if we're going to have lotteries or, whatever.
Okay, well, I know that's fine. Is that?
Yes, you just have about 30 seconds remaining, Mr. Houston.
That's fine. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. And I'd like to welcome Ms. Perrette for her availability here today. I believe it's probably a record for a new Deputy Minister to be in front of public accounts so quick, but we appreciate it, and I wish you luck in your new role, and I look forward to hopefully having an engagement that will benefit Nova Scotians when it comes to ideas of how to improve healthcare. I want to thank the panel for being here, the witnesses for being here. This, as you can imagine, is an important issue for Nova Scotians. We're talking about how the current government, future governments are going to pay for services, improve services, hopefully, would be the end result in some of the decisions that are going to be made over the next few years. And of course, when we're talking about roads, when we're talking about hospitals, when we're talking about schools, they're very close to Nova Scotians. So I want to first talk about the comments from Dr. LaFlèche. Are you a doctor? Deputy LaFlèche. Deputy LaFlèche. He talked about all the good things that government look for in order to enter some of these P3 projects that not only Nova Scotia has done in the past, but other jurisdictions. But the one thing I did not hear from the deputy was, I think, one of the main reasons why I think governments look at these projects, and it's to keep the cost of these projects off the books of the province. And that's, I believe, one of the main reasons why governments look at it. Would you not agree with that, Mr. LaFlèche, that has been probably one of the key reasons past governments have looked at, not only here in Nova Scotia, but across the country, is to keep these, the sheer magnitude of some of these costs off the books of the province, and it looks good for a government not to maybe have a deficit because you need to pay $600 million to build a hospital, for example.
Mr. LaFlèche?
I'm going to start the question, and Ms. Surratt, if you're okay with that, since she's the CFA, will answer the technical part of the accounting part. That was, I think, a reason back in 1996 when the schools that Mr. Houston mentioned were approved, and as well as the Cobequid. The driving force behind that at the time was the financial situation of the government, their ability to borrow. If they borrowed more money, what would that do their interest rate and their credit rating? And there was a great deal of worry at the time. So there was a great deal of the motivator then was to do P3. I'm not talking about the tolling. I'm talking about P3. Was the off-book financing. At this point in time, we adopted GAAP accounting around 2000. I can't give you the exact date. And so that type of objective is no longer achievable. So off-book financing is not what we're looking at here, but perhaps I can let Ms. Surratt talk about that.
Ms. Surratt?
Hi there. I can't speak to the schools because I don't really have too much knowledge of that, but with regards to the Cobequid Pass, in terms of off-book financing, the deputy did mention about the impact of, if we had done it traditionally or conventionally, what it would have done to our overall cost of borrowing. I can't determine that, but it could have had an impact on that. The cost of borrowing in terms of this project was higher, than what our cost of borrowing was at the time, but there certainly are benefits, to be achieved by that. In terms of agreements with bondholders, having the entity non-consolidated, in terms of the legislation that we have in place and in the revenue that is collected, it's used for a specific purpose. If it's a consolidated entity, then it's in our general revenue fund. In terms of the Cobequid Pass, it's a separate, it's owned by the province, but it's a non-consolidated entity. So its asset stays on its books, its excess cash stays on its books, and it's only used for the purpose of that pass. So I think it's a couple of things, in terms of what is the impact to our cost of borrowing, but also requirements from bondholders if we're trying to access certain financing. I think the other thing that's is a consideration is access to cash that federal funding that we might not have previously accessed through, say, for instance, Normal Building Canada funds, right? So looking at P3 funding or that's outside of that. So that's additional federal funds that we might be able to access.
Would you agree that that currently our bond rating is better than it's been in decades here in Nova Scotia, And it's interesting, the comments from Deputy LaFlash, when you see news releases put out by your department just recently on the toll highways, for example, strong emphasis on the cost. And to me, that indicates to the public, oh, look at how much this is going to cost. So, you know, and the government, of course, is going to look at that, putting that kind of amount on the books is not going to be appealing to them, especially with the action of the government over the last 3 years. So anyway, I'm good with that. I'll kind of move into.
Can I just make sure? I want to make sure we don't leave any opinion.
Mr. LaFlash, please continue.
That there's any sort of off-book financing here. The schools, which were theoretically originally off-book financing in '96, all came on the books in the early 2000s. So that didn't work because they're all considered capital leases. The convention center is a capital lease. So even though it's a P3, it's going to be on the books. In fact, we even put on the books the amount we got from other governments for it because we have to put the asset on the books. So, and the new toll highways, we don't know what the arrangements will be yet. But I think what people would be talking about, if they were ever done, would be cost savings in construction. And also the fact that if you have a toll revenue that links to your borrowing, the bond raters look more favorably on that if there's no revenue. So that may affect our credit rating less, but that's only speculation on our part.
And you mentioned the Cobequid Pass, for example, when it was built by the private sector, I think their investment was $66 million. Currently, I believe, in tolls, we're well over $300 million. So when those figures come out and the public find out about some of these projects like that, what could we have done with the other $234 million in Nova Scotia? So I'd like to now go to what the roles are of the department and what the roles of the Department of Health and Department of TIR when it comes to the evaluation of the P3 model. So you have examples where we're looking in front of us about replacement, the redevelopment of the QE2, replacement of the Victoria and Centennial Building. What role does health have in evaluating potentially going down the road of a P3 model in Nova Scotia?
Mr. Wilson, are you directing your question to health?
Mr. LaFlash.
Okay. I hate to, you know, one time I was here and Bruce Fitzner was so lonely. I hate that Ms. Perrette is so lonely, but I will attempt to answer the question.
Don't worry.
Look, we don't do it on ourselves. We have a consortium of departments, and Mr. Houston was quite right to point out we have outside expertise we bring in. So the health department is key to this. They're the client, if you will. We're the builder. The Department of Finance and Treasury Board are very key because they will supply the financial expertise to the project. So it's really a consortium of the three departments that will work together on this with any outside expertise we need. I do want to mention, though, in the previous comment, because I don't want to let it sit, if anybody needs to know where the so-called $240 million went from the Cobequid Pass, we can give them a detailed breakdown of how it went into the roads, et cetera, interest rates, whatever it is. But there's no $240 million missing.
That'd be great. We'd appreciate all the detail. And that's some of the problem that, as an opposition party, has, is that that information isn't available, and often is very difficult to get out of the government. So I appreciate that effort, and hopefully that'll continue on through that process.
Mr. Wilson, Ms. Surratt has a comment related to that. Would you like to hear that?
Please. Yeah, quickly.
Ms. Surratt?
So the Crown does have an annual report that is published. It's on its website. In terms of any toll revenue that has been collected, I can't comment on the amount to date. I certainly can get that amount for you. It all goes back into the pass. And toll revenue is not just to cover the bond financing, it's covering the maintenance, the operation, repairs, capital upgrades, anything that goes into that 45 section of kilometers. If we had done it traditionally, we still would have had those expenses. You would have had your capital expenses, we would have borrowed against it, but you still would have had the ongoing operating, maintenance, capital, and all of that. So we're looking at two different pieces. Yep. I think the other important thing to understand is anything that's in excess that is collected on the toll is actually sitting on the books of the corporation in its bank account, not in the government's general revenue bank account. So there's clear legislation in place as to what we can do. We do not have enough funds to pay off the debt entirely, but the debt will be paid off before 2026.
So I appreciate that. I know I too have limited time, and there's a lot of questions that we can ask around many different aspects of this. So who will ultimately negotiate on behalf of the province for say the hospital, if this is going to move in the direction that I think it may be heading? Who ultimately in government, is it your department, Mr. LaFlèche, who will negotiate it, or is there somebody else?
We will have a team, but it's not that we have a bunch of negotiators sitting there, you know, with holsters on or something. Maybe, John, you could explain how we have the RFSQ that has gone out today. What would happen if we went down any road, whether it be conventional build or a P3, how would that?
Mr. O'Connor.
Okay. If part of delivering all the infrastructure that we do at TIR is continuously assessing, you know, our capacity. This project is a large project, whether it's delivered traditionally or through a P3 model. We have similar challenges with respect to making sure we have resources and the decision-making within our management structures. As Deputy Minister LaFlèche has said, is a consortium of departments with the Health Authority working very closely together. As we move forward, we follow a similar model of governance. We bring in expertise from the private sector. This RFSQ that's been issued today will bring the first level of expertise in to help advise us, help assess whether our project's well suited for P3, but also part of that service will be for them to assess our readiness to even manage a P3. They'll look at our capacity, look at risks that we may have to prepare ourselves. There's a lot of work preparing the procurement of a P3 project, and I've been involved in a number of them in the past, and including some attempts we've made at bringing forward P3s in 2008. And the very onerous amount of work up front, and we're not in a position, as I stated earlier. I'm certainly not an expert, and we don't have the experience in our department with P3s because we haven't been delivering P3s.
Okay, so with that answer, you've kind of answered another one. Would you bring people in, external people in? You said yes. We had introduced legislation some time ago for a financial accountability officer in our province, which would mean bringing someone who has the expertise within government to oversee any P3 projects that the province would be considering in the future. Wouldn't that be beneficial if you're bringing in outside consultants to look at, because the expertise isn't there now? Not to say that you don't have some skills in managing this. Wouldn't that be an option that the government should be looking at? And have you had any discussion on having a financial accountability officer here in the province so that these projects can be vetted, so that Nova Scotians can have confidence that if we go down the road and it looks like we are, that we have people internally who we can turn to. When Department of Health is looking at replacing the VG, we have a financial accountability officer who we know is an expertise who can review it. And even if not that, what role does the Auditor General Office have when it comes to P3 models if we're not going to go to having a separate person in the government? Mr. LaFlèche, maybe?
Well, I don't know anything about the act you introduced. I'm sorry I didn't follow it that closely. But that would be more knowledgeable to my colleague Byron Rayfuse at Finance and Treasury Board. I do know that there is a risk management group which has been set up at Finance and Treasury Board to do these types of things. I also I wouldn't want to at any time not acknowledge the great service provided by my friend Mr. Spicer over there after the fact, of course, and our internal auditor Ted Doan and his group. We do engage in a lot of risk management in terms of projects we run, but at this stage, we don't know what we're going to do here yet in terms of P3. If we do set up P3s, if we do anything on the highway side, we don't know. Unfortunately, the first consultation got rain iced out last night, but it'll be next Monday. And so when we hear,
appreciate that.
we will put something in place if appropriate, for sure.
Well, listen, I respect that, but what you mentioned is a lot of after the fact. I mean, we currently have models. I come from a profession that, and I say the profession has benefited from having an external operator, EMC, for example, and the paramedics and the ground ambulance and air ambulance in the provinces benefit from it. So there are, I can see some benefits, but Nova Scotians are concerned. So why would we wait and go down the road of adding to P3 projects in the province without that? So I'll make sure you get a copy of the legislation that we introduce. We're okay if the government wants to introduce their own or just create the position. That's fine with me. Good ideas come from all areas. So I'm glad that you mentioned that you're going to try to work with the Department of Health, work with other departments when it comes to potential future projects. And one reason why we did, and it was our topic, or one of our requests to have Department of Health here, is that we know through a report from the previous Deputy Minister, Peter Vaughan, that he had done in September of 2014, he talked about P3 models, and that he, in his report, said the premise for proceeding with P3s is typically that the private sector can do the projects more efficiently and can manage risks better. However, the former Deputy Minister mentioned that Auditor Generals across the country have pointed out many P3 projects that have actually been plagued with serious cost overruns. There's a number of projects we can look at. In Ontario, for example, P3 Hospital in Brampton cost $200 million more than initially thought. The University of Quebec in Montreal doubled the cost for a project there. So I'd like to ask the Deputy Minister if she's aware of the former Deputy's concerns around P3 model in use of especially hospitals. And I'm just wondering if you would associate yourself with those concerns, or do you have an opinion on those types of models for health services and health infrastructure?
Ms. Parrott?
Thank you for the question. So I think my first response is that I'm not an expert on P3s, nor am I an expert on capital planning and infrastructure, just for clarity. But what I do appreciate, and I would reiterate the comments of my colleague, Deputy LaFlèche, is that in the provision of healthcare services, including capital or services directly, looking at all the options is critically important, and looking at them with a critical eye is important. So I appreciate that with the pressures in the healthcare system and the pressures of rising costs, certainly we want to have a look at all the options, but with that type of diligence, and as I said, a tested challenge function that's focused on effectiveness and value.
So hopefully some of those options is to keep it internal, use especially ownership of the facilities. Quick question, I think I only have 1 minute. You're talking about moving services out of the Halifax core around the Centennial Building. Has the option of the use of the Cobequid Centre, where we own the property, where it was made to be built onto, come into the discussion over the last little while with you, Mr. LaFlèche, or someone from the Department of Health?
Mr. LaFlèche?
All options will be considered. As you know, those type of collaborative care facilities, we're building one in Shelburne now. The Cobequid was one of the initial ones. There's one in the north end here of Halifax, which we've recently helped restructure in terms of its infrastructure. So those are very much at the forefront, I think, of the government's policy. But maybe Madame Perrette, actually Madame Barbrick, is best to speak to what the future is for those.
Order, I do apologize. We're just running out of time, but perhaps you could answer that later in another round of questioning. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to go back and start with a broad level discussion on what a P3 actually is. And I think the public understands that it basically always is some kind of partnership with the private sector And today we're here to talk about the infrastructure piece. Can you just walk the committee members through what different types of private partnerships are possible in terms of building up infrastructure, the differences between the financing, the design build, or design build operate? And I think the narrative coming from one of the opposition parties is that it's black and white, P3s are always bad, and that we should always go with traditional build. So maybe you can just explain a cursory explanation from the different options that we have.
Mr. LaFlèche?
Well, as I started by saying in the beginning, it's very complex. There's a massive breadth of P3s, and one could consider a simple lease arrangement as a risk reduction, effectively a P3 when we lease office space. So that's the extreme form, but all the way through to a government-owned building, government-operated building. There's a whole bunch of options, and I think John O'Connor will go through some of those acronyms, and maybe, John, you could actually say so that people know what the acronyms stand for.
Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you. Typically, if we focus on hospital projects, the hospital project arrangements are typically the project co is responsible for design, construction, financing, and long-term maintenance of the facility. So they call that design, build, finance, and maintain. So DBFM. So when you hear, there's a lot of terminology being used, that's often the typical arrangement. There are some variations to that: design, build, finance only, and the maintain is not included. There's been some levels of involvement in delivering projects like that around, I think, in Ontario, but they found that it's much better to have the maintenance in. So you have the full life cycle responsibilities. So then there's a good balance struck between the decisions made during design and construction and the responsibilities for long-term maintenance. So that's very important from what we see for best practice across the country, that design, build, finance, and maintain is the optimum model. And then it's a matter of what do you maintain. So obviously the building itself, and then there's some range of whether certain services are kept in or not, like snow removal, housekeeping, and waste removal and things of that nature. So then there's, for our traditional delivery, we also have design build. We have design build and design bid build. So where we have a firm that will, it's important to know that even if we're delivering traditionally, there's a lot of private sector involvement. Many of the infrastructure projects delivered here in Nova Scotia and elsewhere involve the private sector extensively in the overall delivery. So the design of all projects, large projects, is typically managed by the public sector, but the design is delivered by the private sector. The construction is almost always delivered by the private sector. So all the general contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, again, all of that is private sector. Maintenance and operation in Nova Scotia is a mix. There's often some in-house maintenance that's done, and there's outsourced maintenance. So within TIR, we outsource a lot of our maintenance and repair to buildings, including this building. If it needs a new roof, that's outsourced and done by an outside contractor managed by us. So it's a full range of options there, whether it's P3 or traditional delivery. It's the combining of all those different aspects of a project and just how you decide to assemble those.
Okay, no, I thank you for that answer. I think that's the biggest myth that I wanted to get out there, is that it's rare not to have private sector involvement in a project. And when you mention leasing as being probably one of the more limited involvement from the private sector, if for this, for the purpose of today, we're talking about hospitals and building, I heard you say an ambulatory building that may or may not be outside of the city core, or an outpatient clinic. If just that part of the project involved a lease of an existing building, and people should know that the private sector owns a lot more real estate than and buildings that are available for those types of things, that would be basically considered a private partnership or a so-called P3 as part of our project if we just looked at leasing out a building. Am I correct in assuming that?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so there, you go all the way from leasing to all responsibilities for design and construction and maintenance. So in a lease, even in a leased property, like we leased a lot of space in, say, for Department of Health, for example, since they're here, that fit up of that space, all of the work to fit up that space, design it, fit up and maintain it is done by the private sector.
Okay, and if we were to look at the design, build, operate, maintain option, in the analysis, does government provide a type of ghost bid internally that can be analyzed up against the bids that come from the private sector to ensure that, you know, we have an option here to do it in-house, we have another option, what is the best value for money?
So the most significant component of the work that we're just to undertake with this RFSQ that's just being issued, that's referred to today, is the value for money. So the value for money exercise does value the cost of delivering a project using a traditional delivery, and it also values the cost of delivering using a P3 delivery. And the costing that's provided there is comparing the different costs of design and construction and financing, the risks that we transfer from if we had a P3 arrangement, what risk would be transferred. Those risks are also cost, and all of that costing is included in that value for money assessment. And yes, that forms then a model of costing for the particular project, and that would serve as the guide and the benchmark as you move ahead with a P3 delivery.
Right, so yeah, risk transfer seems to me is an important part, and obviously we have many examples of government trying to manage projects, and I can't really think of any one large-scale project that didn't have cost overruns in government. When we think of the Truro Hospital, we think of right here in HRM, the Wash Mill overpass with cost overruns, and so I think that the risk component is important. When you give that management side over to the operator, is someone in government there to oversee and manage the project to make sure that everything that's negotiated within that contract is being adhered to? And would that be you, yourself, John?
Well, as we said earlier, we'll have to assess our resources and our capacity to manage contracts. There will be a lot of people involved. I'm currently the lead person on the Convention Center project, and yes, I am day-to-day involved in managing that project, and I have been involved when all the way through as the agreements were put in place. So I know the agreements very well. I know all the requirements that are to be provided as part of that agreement. So yeah, that would be the same type of an approach that we'd be taking on any future P3 arrangement, that there's a continuous need to monitor during delivery of the project, and this is the part that's really important, there's a need to ongoing monitoring of these contracts for the whole concession period, which is likely like a 25 or 30-year period. Okay. Because most of the health projects have built into the contracts have numerous clauses built in for performance and performance indicators around uptime per rooms. If there's any failure on the part of the project co to deliver on anything, there are penalties built in, there are so on. So there's a great deal of monitoring required over the period of the contract.
So with a P3 build, who would bear the burden of those cost overruns?
During a P3 build, once the contract is put in place, the responsibility and the risk for construction costs is with the project co. We call it project co, which is the term they use for P3s for the consortium that's created, and the cost. So all the risk around construction and the management of the design and the construction is with the project co.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that there's a higher incentive for the quality of the build to be there when the private sector is bearing that burden than there would be if they're just handling the contract with a traditional build for government?
Yeah, it'd be fair to say. So, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's the arrangement when the responsibility for design and construction and long-term maintenance is all lumped together under one contract. There's two advantages. One is that you know your costs up front, you know your full cost of that infrastructure for a 25 or 30-year period. but it also allows the proper balance between investing in capital versus maintenance. So the more decisions you make as you're building your building and designing the building around product selection and longevity of products and systems in the building will pay dividends throughout the concession period. So when it's all tied together in one arrangement, the team is able then to balance quality and longevity against long-term maintenance.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, from a Canadian perspective, you mentioned another province, I think you said over $100 million, everything's P3. Is this typical across the country for other provinces? Do you know of other provinces that limit the P3 involvement in their infrastructure? And I'm just wondering, because you use that value of scale has an impact on it when you get into massive projects. Obviously, the QE2 redevelopment takes a lot of different competencies that may not be available within a government department. So two questions really into one is, what are other provinces doing, and does scale have a part to play in whether or not some components are going P3 and some aren't?
A number of jurisdictions, and we work closely with all the jurisdictions across Canada. We have a number of different groups that meet on a regular basis. There's a Deputy Ministers of Public Works forum that meets once a year. We have good insight into policies and practices around the country in the area of business that we're involved in. And I'm aware that in Ontario, I believe British Columbia, and I believe maybe Manitoba, they have policies around P3 projects, infrastructure, and they set thresholds. And the Public Works, or the federal government, it used to be Public Works Government Services Canada, can't recall the new name now. They also have a policy, and they have thresholds, and they were at one point somewhere around 50 million, but a lot of them are 100 million now. Largely because of the upfront cost of preparing bids. So from the government end and preparing the documents for procurement, but on the consortium end, and there's a lot of work and cost for them to respond to bids. So the project has to be substantial before it's usually considered by projects. There's an interest enough across the country, and interest in the financing folks to invest. It has to be a large enough investment and for a long enough period of time to get the interest.
So the other provinces, are they open to basically allowing you to look at those contracts and go through them and evaluate them and see if we can learn from the best practices from virtually all of the P3 projects that have happened across the country? Or is that something we're not?
Yes, they are, and we've already been meeting with some of them. We've met with Infrastructure Ontario in person. They have been very forthcoming to provide us copies of RFPs that they have recently used for healthcare projects. We found some that are very, very similar. They're renovation addition type projects, very similar to what we're contemplating here at the Halifax Infirmary. They've certainly, Ontario have been very helpful, British Columbia as well, and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has helped us a lot, even with this procurement we're doing now for P3 advisory services. Saskatchewan has been very helpful to give us their advice, best practices on that particular RFP as well.
So that would likely inform you when the P3 is the best model. And can you articulate, in your view, when P3 is the best model to go forward with a given project?
The experience that we've had, we had some experience back in 2008 where we took 10 projects and we had partnerships with British Columbia, assessed those projects, and then went through market sounding and a sort of a screening. We used their screening tool. And out of that, the projects that were considered to be worth considering for a P3 were typically the ones that were large enough. In that time, maybe at least 50 million. I think today is more like $100 million for sure. They have to be reasonable to be able to transfer the risk. So if it's a large renovation, it's very difficult to draw all the lines and define the scope well enough to manage the risk. So new builds certainly are much better than a renovation project. And so they're usually large infrastructure projects, longer contracts, and allowing the project co to take full responsibility for design, construction, and operations or maintenance. are typically the ones that seem to be, well, better suited for a P3 delivery.
Okay. So, and going back, I'd have to agree with my colleague that Mr. Houston, when he says that the public generally isn't against P3s, they're against getting bad deals. So it does come down to the negotiation at the table, who has leverage in any given project that's being discussed, and the expertise that's behind them. So competition's good when you have different bidders, obviously. What experience and expertise do we have within government to be able to make sure that we are negotiating as best we can, and that we still have an ability to walk away if it's not the right, if all these companies come in and no option's a good option? What do we bring to that table?
So as we had been indicating, that we'll be assessing our capacity. We do have experience, a lot of experienced people that are experienced in delivering infrastructure. We have people within Department of Finance and others in government that have experience as well to bring to this work. Part of the RFSQ that's currently issued will evaluate, look internally, just add our capacity and our expertise and identify gaps if we have gaps. We will have to surround ourselves with specialized expertise as well from the private sector to help advise us as we move forward. And we have had experience ourselves. We have a team in place that managed the development of the agreements and the contracts for the convention center. I was involved previously when we led some P3 projects in 2008, all the way through to creation of RFPs for the correction facilities and the trunk mobile radio project. So we have some expertise, but we would have to assess and develop further expertise if we decide to pursue a P3 delivery.
Okay, so you mentioned the convention center, which was a project that was initiated by the NDP government, who has explicitly said they're against P3s. All P3 models are bad. What is the World Trade and Convention Center a private partnership? Just a question. Is it a P3 project?
Yes, it is.
It is a P3 project. So the NDP government initiated that. Is there any other projects that would be considered a private partnership under the last NDP government that exist today that you can think of?
The trunk mobile radio system was started. We actually had an agreement with P3 Canada in 2000 and I'm not sure what year, 12 maybe, on that particular project. It was a joint effort between Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. And that particular RFP did not continue through right to the end. It got to the end but didn't get awarded. But it was definitely set up as a P3, and we had P3 funding, and so it was...
okay. What about Maritime Link? Is that a P3 project?
I'm not familiar enough with that to answer that.
Okay, we're talking about healthcare then. What about Scotia Surgery? Is there any private involvement in that project by the NDP government?
So the Scotia Surgery, I'd probably let our colleagues from health answer that one.
Is it a P3 project, yes or no?
Ms. Barbrick?
It's a private operator.
Thank you. Is Deo Wu Trenton, was that a private partnership with the public sector?
I'm not familiar with that project.
Mr.
That's
LaFleche,
right.
we'll let your mic come on there and respond.
Unfortunately, we would not be able to answer. We're not familiar with the details of that particular deal, but I would have to ask my colleague Murray Coolican, the deputy
okay, and I
minister.
appreciate that. I guess I'm just pointing out the hypocrisy with the statements coming from the party that are unilaterally opposed to every P3 project, but they put through numerous projects in their government, and they continue to use the rhetoric against the public. And the World Trade Convention Center is one that steps out, because that's design, build, operate. We went through all the different types you can do. That's essentially like the full out P3. That's a design, that's a build, and that's a maintain project.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Your time is just expiring. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Zan Mr. Houston for 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you,
PC
Mr.
Caucus,
Chair.
Mr. Houston.
I do want to talk to the Department of Health. In June 2016, the Auditor General stressed that a solution to the urgent challenges with the VG site must be found soon. So would ask just from the Department of Health perspective, do you have a timeline as to when you want to know how these facilities are going to be built? Like, what's your, what have you put forward for a, I don't want to say deadline, but when would you like to know how these facilities are going to be built?
Ms. Barbrick?
I think the commitments that have already been made through the RFP publishing and pieces that have been published to date identify 2022 as full decanting from the Centennial and VG.
Okay, so when would a decision if you back up from that, when would you need a decision to be made on how it's going to be financed?
So I think all of the pieces in the RFPs that have been issued to date are working against that deadline. So the elements that are, including the contract that went out today, are about backing those out to meet that 2022 date.
Okay, do you know what the date is offhand that they have to decide how it's going to be financed? Maybe somebody from TIR knows.
I think I'd have to defer to TIR.
Yeah, just a date of when the decision has to be made, that's all.
Mr. O'Connor?
I can answer that one. The target date that we have set in our timelines is around this time next year.
So that's so a year from now, we'll know if it's a P3 or if it's conventional.
Well, a year from now, we'll have the information to make the decision.
Okay, so it's going to take a year to decide. So we're a year away from a decision as to how it's even going to be financed.
Yeah. And if I could, I'll explain why it's a year.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to get
because the planning has to happen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a perspective in my mind. So back in I think it was April 2016, the Premier started to announce some stuff about the QE2 redevelopment. It was never really clear what was actually being announced, but it was clear that whatever it was going to be announced, which wasn't really understood by the public. Premier was going to do it on time and on budget, and when he was asked what the budget was, he said, well, there's really no budget. So, but I guess my question for today is, that was back in April 2016. It's pushing on a year. There were certainly some things that were identified as the moving of services that would have to take place. I guess I'd ask a very specific question. Have any services been moved around over the last couple months, or where are we at on things like, there was talking about integrating services over to Dartmouth General or the Nova Scotia Cancer Centre, but are things happening?
Ms. Barbrick?
So the beds, the 5th floor of the Dartmouth General Hospital, beds have started to be relocated on that piece, which is part of the decanting story. The Hants OR design piece that's happening now is part of the decanting, and the additional OR capacity that's been announced is part of that decanting. So yes, the work is underway now. The big piece of work that has already been out there is the functional design piece that's happening between ourselves and TIR and the Nova Scotia Health Authority about the needs for the new facilities. So the result of that work, which will be pretty much a year from now, will inform what's the next layers of decanting that have to happen.
Okay, so the functional analysis is happening now, and the timeline for that is a year from now?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about, there's a discussion, I'll come back to TR, there's a discussion happening in the province about tolls. And I think it's difficult to have that discussion without people knowing all the facts and how long a toll would be and what the toll is, and to make a proper decision. Now, we do have a toll road in this province. It was certainly the understanding of the taxpayers of the province that the toll would be removed when the debt was repaid. In fact, I think that was the government position. Minister Russell confirmed way back in 2005 that when the debt is repaid, there would no longer be a toll, and the date for that was 2018. Now, recently, your department, Deputy LaFleche, decided that the toll would actually continue. And I did have a look at your internal briefing note, and it was pretty clear that this is from your internal briefing note. Although stated publicly by former Transportation Minister Ronald Russell that tolls would be eliminated once the debt is repaid, the Highway 104 Western Alignment Act declares that it is acceptable to continue collecting tolls after debt repayment for continued operation, maintenance, repairs, improvements, etc. So we had a public expectation that the toll would be removed when the debt was repaid. Behind the closed doors of government, there was a decision made that the tolls would actually continue after the debt was able to be repaid, and that they would continue because they're allowed to under the Act, and that they would continue for maintenance and operations and repairs and stuff. So in this situation, the continuation of the tolls is for maintenance and operating. And I guess I would ask a specific question about that. If that's what's happening with that road, if the tolls are being continued for maintenance purposes, are there any other roads in the province where there is a toll for maintenance purposes, or are the taxpayers being, particularly the ones that use that quite often, being disadvantaged by the continuation of that toll? I'd asked Ms. Surratt the specific question, are there any other roads in the province that have a toll for maintenance purposes, or is this the only road where a toll will be essentially implemented for maintenance?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other highway that has a toll on it other than our bridges, which is part of our highway system.
Okay.
But I do want to, the decision to extend tolls for maintenance and operations has not been made by government. We have not brought that forward. The decision that was made for this budget was actually not to make prepayments. That was the decision that was brought forward. The rationale for that is that there's no benefit to the taxpayer to pay cash early to the bondholders. As a bond, we owe 30 years of interest payments. So what happens, so I think what's misunderstood and what has not been communicated to the public is that the corporation had taken the practice based on previous direction from previous governments to use the excess cash and make prepayments.
But I think Mr. Chair, if I may, because I think the expectation of the people of the province was that the tolls would be removed when the debt was repaid.
But the debt's not repaid, though.
Exactly. But
right?
if there's
Mr.
Chair, please. If there's an opportunity to repay the debt, whether somebody says that's early because it's not in accordance with the amortization schedule or not, if there's an opportunity to repay the debt, then the repayment of the debt opens up what the people are expecting is no more tolls. So I guess the government of the day. No, I don't. In the interest of time, I think the point that I want made, and I want people to understand, is that when people enter
order, Mr. Houston, I want you to make your point because you have your time and it's well within your right. But if you are asking a question, please allow an answer.
Mr. Chair, the point is that there's an opportunity to repay the debt, early or not. When the debt is repaid, the toll comes off. And I think what my request of, not my question of, my request of the department is, as you are having discussions with Nova Scotians about tolls, if you set up an expectation with people that this toll will only be for a certain period of time until the debt is repaid, and the government has an opportunity to repay the debt and remove the toll, they should do that. People should have a proper understanding of how the toll is going to operate. That's my only request of the department, because when we talk about the confusion and around P3 models and how people are suspicious of them and leery of them, yes, they're confused about them. Yes, they're suspicious of them. Yes, they're leery of them, and for good reason. Because in this province, we haven't had good deals on P3s, and we've had an opportunity to have reasonable deals with the toll removal. Decisions have been taken not to do that, and it's not fair. And in terms of the Auditor General, in the fall 2016 report. The Auditor General said that the Department of Education, in response to an Auditor General request, the Department of Education says it has initiated discussions with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal to revise the school capital planning process. And that was in order to take politics out of school planning. I think it was just before maybe the Premier's school got announced. But I guess when I look at that and I hear the Department of Education saying, we're talking to TIR about revising the school capital planning, and I asked TIR, have you looked at some of the way schools have been financed in this province over the years with P3s and stuff, just to assess where they're at, so we can, if we're going to revise the school capital planning process, we can actually know what's happened and what's worked and what's not. And when TR says we haven't really actually looked at that, I don't know if it's the Department of Education that has a different interpretation of initiating discussions or if it's CIR, but I don't think it's in the spirit of what the Auditor General was talking about. I'd like to for my final question, Mr. Chair, just one more question, sir, Deputy LaFlèche. In terms of the rudder situation with the Blue Nose, we know that a wooden rudder was taken off the Blue Nose, a steel rudder was used. Now we're going back to a wooden rudder. I'd like to ask you a very specific question. Where's the steel rudder that is no longer going to be used on the Blue Nose?
Mr. Chair, I think we have 2 hours on February 8th to talk about that, and I'll have the people here who can appropriately answer those questions on February 8th.
Okay, I'm not aware of that, Mr. Chair. Perhaps Mr. LaFlèche is a step ahead of me. I will ask.
You requested it.
I will ask. It's not.
Order, just for the record, that meeting has not yet been approved. So, Mr. Houston, you just have about 15 seconds.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a request of the chair to the department. Could you mentioned that you used outside consultants on the negotiation of the Yarmouth ferry contract. Could you please provide for the committee how much was paid to outside consultants for the negotiation of the Yarmouth ferry contract, how long they were on retainer, and who it was, if you're able to, under the agreement? Just please provide the information.
Ms. Surratt will follow up with that. You'll be pleasantly surprised.
Thank you. The time for questions for the PC Caucus has expired. We'll now move to the NDP Caucus, beginning with Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I only have a quick question, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague. We know the relationship between the current Liberal government, the Premier, and our unions, especially those who represent healthcare workers, has not been a good one over the last 3.5 years. Has not been a good one. With this announcement today, and the requests that will be going out, is that request a break the union exercise, or can you commit today to ensure that health care services that will be provided under whatever model you go forward with will be provided by the current members who provide health care and who are represented by, I think, some of represented by the unions that they are represented by today? And it could be for Mr. LaFlèche, and definitely I'd love to have a comment from Ms. Perrette also on that.
Mr. LaFlèche.
So what we're looking at there is infrastructure, not healthcare service provision. And P3 is one option. We said we, as civil servants, were required to bring forward all reasonable options. So we're doing some work and going to bring that option forward. It does not relate to health service delivery. It relates to the building.
Could you commit to ensuring that that's something that you would like to see, is making sure that current members provide that care? And if you're not willing to do that, I'm wondering if Ms. Perrette could.
I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
Would you today commit to ensuring that the healthcare delivery is being done by healthcare providers that currently provide that service? You will oversee models in the future. Can you commit to at least supporting that initiative?
Yeah, we're the builders and in many cases operators of infrastructure. So the actual client is the Department of Health and Wellness. So I'll let Ms. Barbrick answer such questions.
Ms. Perrette.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the question. I think it's an important question, and I think it's one of the factors that get considered in the value equation. So I take note of it, and we'll keep it front and center, keep it in mind.
I appreciate the clarity on that, but I'm concerned, and I believe some will be concerned. So I would imagine I'll know our next campaign in the next while. So I'd like to pass it over to my colleague.
Okay, we'll move to Ms. Zan.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming in here today, folks. I know it can get a little bit heated sometimes, but it's good to have you here. Auditor generals from across the country have called into question the use of the P3 model for public infrastructure. And it seems that in a number of provinces, governments spent substantially more of taxpayers' dollars by using the P3 model than they would have spent by using the public model. And that's why we in the NDP Caucus have grave concerns about this. So for instance, in Ontario, the Auditor General revealed that a P3 hospital in Brampton cost the public $200 million more than if it had been publicly financed. In Quebec, a P3 project at the Université de Québec à Montréal doubled the cost from $200 million to $400 million of the public purse. In BC, the Sea to Sky Highway is set to cost taxpayers $220 million more than if it had been financed and operated publicly. And here in Nova Scotia, of course, we're aware of the P3 school debacle, which included the fact that the Auditor General here reported that 2 developers actually earned an extra $52 million by subcontracting work back to the province. So my question is there not enough evidence before us to actually reject this model for public infrastructure development?
The question to Mr. LaFleche?
Yes, please.
Mr. LaFleche.
Yeah, so I want to point out that it seems every question we get long speeches. And in answering the question, I'm not debating the speech because I don't want to get into that debate, but Mr. Houston's done
I'm
that,
not the
and
one
Mr.
that's
Zahn, and
trying to shorten
I know
your
that's your
answering.
job. So in answering the question, I'm not agreeing with any of the content of those speeches. I'm trying to answer the question that comes at the end of the long speech.
Is there not enough evidence before us now to reject this model for developing public infrastructure?
No, I think there's enough evidence that we have to take caution when we do this. Everything, Auditor Generals do their job. It's a very good job. It's a job that is needed. And they find and report on the ones where there are problems. Where they don't find and report usually is the ones, or at least the public doesn't really have any interest, is where they report it's all working very well. So we see many examples, and we've seen them ourselves, and we've talked to all sides of the equation, the government, the operator, the builder, the client who uses it. We've seen good models, we've seen bad models in Canada, and which gives us, and governments continue to do P3s, and they don't do it for off-book financing. So that gives us enough trust that there are good P3s, and they can be done well. Mr. Houston very appropriately pointed out that in many cases, some part of this is what sort of deal you get, whether you entered it with appropriate leverage and whether you bargain well and whether you get a good contract, and whether the deal is actually appropriate for a P3. Maybe some of these projects haven't been appropriate and they've gone badly. Governments did them for other reasons. In the very early P3s, a lot was done for off-book financing, so that was the main motive. So the due diligence wasn't done on the other things that we've mentioned here today. So we've got to look at each one individually and not automatically, ideologically just eliminate P3s. But what we've got to do is advise my job and the job of my colleagues here is to advise government when it might be good and when it might not. Then we try and get the best deal we can. And if we can't get a good deal, even though it may be appropriate for a P3, then we will advise them not to do it. If we can get a good deal and we find that there are appropriate benefits for the taxpayer, for citizens of Nova Scotia, then we will advise them that this is something they should do. So that's basically where we are. We're not ideological about it either way.
Thank you, and we're not either. We just want to get a good deal for the public because a lot of these projects have cost the public tons and tons, millions of dollars, more than needed to be paid. The Auditor General also is concerned that on top of the profits that were made by developers off the schools here in Nova Scotia, they also acquired property that's now worth substantially more than it was back in the late 1990s. So how did developers actually acquire the land on which these P3 schools were built? Did they already own the land, or did they purchase the land, or were they given the land by government?
Mr. O'Connor?
We don't, I have to go back sort of in my memory on that, but I think it's a mix of all of them. But I don't believe there's any government land for schools, but they're all privately held properties. The correctional facility in Burnside, we did a land lease. We did own the property in Burnside. We did a land lease. I can't remember the term of the lease, But for the schools, I think it's all privately held.
Right. Okay, so the private developers still own that land then?
As far as I'm aware.
Right, and as I said, so there's a concern that that land would be worth a lot more money now than it was when they bought it. So where will we find the money being spent to purchase the P3 schools that are accounted for now? Is it going to be this year's budget, next year's budget, and under which department? The ones that we're going to be buying back. It's been announced that we're going to be purchasing the P3 schools.
Mr. LaFleche?
These are questions which are really for the Deputy Minister of Finance and Treasury Board.
Okay.
I can't tell you until we actually purchase them. We will not be paying for them, but he would be best placed to give you a schedule. I think every individual,
Thank you.
every
Okay.
school lease is different.
Is it? Yes, and I just wondered if you might be aware of when that's going to take place. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the twinning, the highway twinning. While the public consultations around the highway twinning is taking place, is the government concurrently looking at different approaches to development? For instance, not just the P3 versus public model only, and with respect to the quoted accidents, the estimate of accidents, collisions that are prevented per 8, I believe it's 8, is it 8 miles or 8 certain, prevented per 8 stretches of highway per year if it's twinned. Do you have any other types of models that you're looking at other than just the P3 model versus the public model?
Okay, so the consultations will start now next Monday, and I think some of that information will be available there. There'll also be a video from Mr. Fitzner talking about some of the things you've asked questions to. I would note that if we do tolling, doesn't mean we're necessarily going to do P3.
Right.
Okay, those are separate questions. Doesn't mean we won't.
Right,
but
I'm
doesn't mean we
asking,
will.
are you looking at other ones too?
So we're at the very early end of that, so we're just having a discussion with Nova Scotians on whether they would like to have some highways improved earlier than normally would be possible under current financing arrangements through a tolling mechanism. That's the stage of this discussion. To get to issues of whether it's going to be done through what type of P3 model or even a P3 model, how it will work in terms of operator, that's a future stage. Because if Nova Scotians decide they will not want to do this overwhelmingly, then we don't have to get into that discussion at this time.
Right.
So some of that, what you've asked, is for a future discussion. Some of it can be answered, I think, in the consultations that are going forward, and I'm sure we can provide you with the consultation material. I don't know if the website is up already.
I'm going to go to one of them anyway, but I know at Monday's technical briefing on highway twinning, the slideshow listed questions that will be asked at the public consultation sessions, and there were no questions that asked about public support for the P3 model. So is that because you're mainly just focusing on the tolling rather than...
It's the tolling and earlier twinning versus the conventional method. And, you know, we're talking 20 to 30 years conventionally with the existing funds available to governments versus maybe 5 years if we go with a tolling model. So that's what we're really focusing on now. That's the question to Nova Scotians.
Okay. The other thing is that there have been studies that have done about the other options for reducing accidents on highways other than twinning. So where are the public able to access studies that look at options that perhaps aren't just the P3 related for paying for highway improvements and for other than tolls? Do you know where there are any reports that we could look at and tell the public where they can look at for other methods or options available to reduce accidents that are not the current model being promoted?
Yes, we can get, the best thing to do would be to get you a list of those, and I think my staff in the Highway Division, there's all sorts of different options. Whether those options would be acceptable for Nova Scotians is another question, and whether they're financially viable. In other words, would they still require additional revenue from the current revenue streams we could access? They probably would require additional revenue, so there is some expense associated with those also. But there are other options. We've talked about them before. We've started implementing some of them. Mr. Porter's over there. You see, we put cat's eyes. I'll call them cat's eyes. I don't know the proper technical term in Canada, but in the U.S. they're cat's eyes. We put those in the causeway. You know, there are various safety measures we can introduce. We could introduce at some places, you see, we've got concrete barriers. So let us get you a list of what could be done.
That would be great. That would be awesome. Thank you. The other thing is I'm getting a lot of messages from people who are concerned about a proponent in the Fall River area who seems to be being, they feel, aided and abetted in being approved to and extending approvals for 4 quarries that are waiting for a P3 contract on Highway 103. I believe it's Scotia Materials. And they say that the same proponent also received a 24-hectare gift of aggregate-rich land through a land swap in Tantallon, which was mischaracterized as an increase in land value for the Crown, but turns out that the land that the Crown received was basically wetlands and swamp. They say it's a year since the land swap occurred, and the only piece of property in Nova Scotia owned by this proponent remains unassessed. They said that the proponent has never submitted tenders on any road work in any of the 3.5 years since these existing quarries have been approved. And they are concerned that nobody seems to care that this particular proponent is being set up in the Fall River area to bid on the Duke Street to Porters Lake Highway. So do you have any comment you could make about that?
Really, I don't know what that's all about.
Okay.
I do know that we have a provision in the Highways Act for allowing access to quarry material on government land in a certain way. I think we could show you that provision if you wish. I don't know if it has anything to do with this, but it sounds like a Department of Environment regulatory matter.
And is Scotian Materials going to be one of the people putting a tender out for a P3 for that area?
Time has expired. We'll have to move to the Liberal Caucus now, and Mr. Stroink.
Thank you very much. I guess my question is more, it's not really a question, it's an opportunity for Ms. Surratt to answer the question that the member from Pictou East obviously didn't want you to answer or show you the respect that you deserve in this chamber. So with that, I would ask that you take the time that you need to answer that question so he might learn something today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what is misunderstood about the decision that was made for this budget to not make prepayments is there's a couple of things that has just not been communicated out there. But we have to take into consideration the success of the highway in terms of the revenue and the tolling that it brings in. We also have to take into consideration the legislation in place that restricts what that revenue can be used for. And we also have to take into consideration the excess cash that results from that. In terms of what we identified was that the corporation was making prepayments. They've to date made $20 million, $5 million intervals. But what that does is they just take it out of the excess cash and they give it to the bondholder. So it goes from their bank account to a bondholder's bank account. Anything that we collect in revenue is for the benefit of the toll payer. So if the Crown Corporation has an opportunity to use that excess cash, invest it, make revenue, interest revenue, then it's for the best interest ultimately of Nova Scotians and the toll payer. Because paying off the debt early is no benefit. We still owe 30 years of interest payments on it. So the direction that we made was don't make the prepayments, let it go into your excess cash, invest it, you get revenue as a result of that, and at some point in time, well prior to 2026, you'll make a lump sum payment and you'll pay the debt and the interest off at that time. So over the next 18 months, as a department, we need to bring forward to government a decision as to, and options, you know, what's going to happen once the debt gets paid off. So it wasn't, if we make prepayments, we're still going to get to that point in time where it's well before 2026 because the toll, that highway is making more revenue than what was anticipated. We can't spend it. It's right now there's 3 restrictive funds that are on the books of that corporation, and 2 of them, one is related to a debt payment, the other one is the excess, and we have a maintenance as well. But at some point in time, they're going to grow to a point where we can make a lump sum payment and pay off the full debt and the outstanding interest. We're not there yet. We need about $65 million, $65 to $70 million. But at that point in time, it's better for the corporation to keep the money and invest it and make interest, as opposed to giving it to a bondholder so they can invest it and make interest. So that was the decision that was made. It's that it's in our best interest for them to keep the money and invest it and make interest. It stays with the corp, and at some point in time, we'll have enough to pay off the debt. So it wasn't about not wanting to pay the debt off early. We will get to that point under both scenarios. It's just under our scenario, actually, we'll get there a little bit earlier because we've collected more revenue for Nova Scotians.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Stroink. We'll move to Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, folks, for being with us today. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to get a couple of quick questions in. Maybe to Mr. LaFlèche. I've been around here a few years. You've been around here a whole lot more, as have some of your colleagues. P3, I've heard that probably since I've been here, I guess. How long has this gone on in the province? This is not new. This is something that's been considered back and forth probably multiple times.
Well, I've been here since '94. The first P3 that I know of were the schools in the Qualifications passed, so that's over 20 years.
Right. So this discussion around all of this is certainly not new. But I would ask, I've probably heard more about it in the last short while than I have in a long while, but maybe more people are paying attention to it. I don't know, or understanding it. Maybe a little bit more. That could be too. But why is it so significant, do you think, now as opposed to what it was before? Or maybe I just missed it as being significant before.
No, I think originally P3s for many governments in Canada were used for off-book financing. I think that was the original impetus. When government gap accounting, public sector gap accounting came in, we were the first province actually in Canada to get it. That mitigated that benefit there. But then P3s were used for other advantages, which John O'Connor has talked about. They've matured over the years. In some provinces, they are the tool of choice automatically for any project above a certain value. And I think you've seen a great deal of experience built upon a base which started over 20 years ago, so that the P3s that are done today or were done 5 years ago are very different from the ones done 10, 15, 20 years ago. People have learned, as some of the members here have alluded to, from past experiences and incorporated that in future ones. The private sector has also adjusted their sort of approach in P3s to a point where people are starting to get comfortable with where a P3 works, what type of deal is needed, and where it doesn't work. So where it works and it delivers real benefits for the taxpayer, you see governments using P3s. Where it doesn't work, because we've seen in the past it hasn't worked, or we don't have the right mechanisms, legal, accounting, the right negotiating strategy to put one in place, people don't use it. So I think it's just become a tool for getting things done. One of the areas one would look at is a differentiation of expertise. In our world, the health department or the health authority is very good at delivering services, but they're not good at buildings. They're not good at operating buildings. So they tend, in other provinces, to leave the building part of it to a private partner. That's what they do in Ontario. And they focus on what they're good on, healthcare delivery. So that's the sort of compromise that comes out, and everybody's doing what they're good at, and that delivers the best value for the citizens of the province. And I think you've seen a degree of comfortableness with that evolve as P3s have had a lot of history and we've had a lot of experience. So that's why you see a lot more of them today.
We talked about, a few minutes ago, there's some discussion, the previous government, the NDP government, obviously went into some P3 arrangements. Prior to that, John Hamm, Rodney MacDonald, did we see P3 arrangements at that time?
Well, I think John O'Connor described, and it's in your 547 pages of material, a P3 partnership with P3 BC, which was put together in 2008 that looked at 11 or 12 different projects. And in fact, one or two of them were pushed ahead.
So can I
yes.
just ask Paul on that successfully, or?
Well, was the Nova Center one of those, John? No. So the one that was successful was a trunk mobile radio.
Right.
Unfortunately, one of the partners, not private, government partners, pulled out, and we went back at it another way. But it was the first P3 under P3 Canada, and you know, looked like it would have been very successful. So yes, every government that I think I've been involved in here, of all three political strikes who have been governing since I've been in power, have done P3s.
I know we've only got about 3 minutes left, I think, Mr. Chair, somewhere around there.
Until 10:54.
54, thank you. I want to talk a bit, you mentioned it early on, Mr. LaFleche, in your opening statement around our deal, if you want to call it that, with EHS, the ambulance system. Is that a P3? Is that how you describe that?
Ms. Barbrick is prepared to speak to that.
Certainly, thank you.
Ms. Barbrick?
On the continuum of P3 models that Deputy LaFleche outlined in his opening statements, yes, absolutely, EHS is a P3 model, and there are a number of others that we've engaged in over really the last 15 years.
And that's something that's been in place, and I know from having worked there as a paramedic for many years, it's been in place for a good number of years and started a long time ago. I would assume we would consider that to be successful.
We would, and much like Deputy LaFleche is outlining, it's all in the contract negotiation. So I think with the EHS, we've established a very good contract that has clear deliverables and performance impacts, and it's worked very well.
But it wouldn't be considered, and forgive me if I've got this wrong, and I guess I'm just thinking back to the days when I was there, it wouldn't be considered quite the same as a, well, I think Mr. LaFleche has mentioned it earlier, they're all a little different anyway. It's more the model than the project, I'll call it that. Yes. And this has been an ongoing one since, I think in and around 97, 98, 2000. I remember all the transition period there. It took a few years for that to happen.
Yes.
I know I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that and say thanks very much for being here again. Thanks, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you very much. That concludes questions for today. Thank you for answering, and we do want to give you some time, although we are very short for time, if you would like to provide some closing comments.
Yeah, I'd like to first apologize,
Mr. LaFleche.
I was told that we were on for February 8th on the Blue Nose, so I would have left that question for Shannon Delbridge to answer. But if we're not on, we can answer that question later for him. I can give you a speculation. We have the rudder, and I think it's at Miller Lake. But it may not be at Miller Lake yet. It may be in transit. So if he wants to know where it is, and we're going to dispose of it in an appropriate way when we at the appropriate time.
Thank you.
Okay, in terms of P3s, I hope we've been clear that the government does not have any ideological stand on P3s. We want to get the best deal for Nova Scotians. We want to employ our own assets, financial and otherwise, in the best way. And we were being very careful to look at each particular circumstance before we commit to a P3 or a conventional build. That's what the RFSQ is about today that we released. And we take the points that were made by some of the members opposite, that we have to have a good negotiating team, and we will do our best to make sure that we're not guilty of not having the best negotiating team possible. I've already admitted that we're not experts, but I also feel there are no real experts for every situation out there. You do your best to get your best deal on behalf of taxpayers, but you also want to make sure that the private sector is able to deliver its side. There's no good making a great deal with someone who does not have the financial capacity to back up their deal. So that's another thing you have to look at. It's very easy to take advantage of someone who doesn't have the assets to deliver on their end of the deal. So we're approaching this cautiously, but optimistically, hoping that benefits can be achieved for Nova Scotians. And if they can be achieved, we will do some P3s. If they can't be achieved, we won't do them. So I'll conclude with that.
Thank you, Mr. LaFleche. Ms. Perrette, would you like to provide some closing comments?
Just to reiterate my thanks for having us here. I think it was a good discussion from our perspective that we benefited from, so thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one item of committee business. It was deferred from our January 18th meeting. There is a motion put forward by Mr. Houston that we fill the February 8th open date with witnesses from Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal to specifically talk about the Blue Nose 2 and some of the recent costs. Are there any comments on that motion? It's now put before the committee. Mr. Rankin?
Yes, I had prior discussions with Mr. Houston, and I just felt that we would be able to advance one of their topics from the next agenda-setting meeting, and therefore they would be putting this topic forward for February 8th, and then in the agenda setting, they would be limited to one topic, and then the other two parties would put forward their two topics as normal.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. All those in favor of the motion? Motion is approved. Our clerk will make note of that. Our next meeting is on February the 1st. We'll have Department of Municipal Affairs as a witness to discuss sustainable transportation programs. Is there any further business to come before the committee? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned.